Welcome to this update and addendum to Population at the Speed of Life, prepared specifically for Blount County to add the newly released 2020 Census Population Count in context of 1950 to 2010 population growth dynamics, 2010 to 2020 census estimates, and 2020 to 2070 projections. Hi, I am John Lamb, producer and presenter of the Population at the Speed of Life series. I am president of East Tennessee Quality Growth, a 501c3 nonprofit organization covering the 16 counties shown on the map. This presentation is a continuing part of outreach to Blount County. The county grew decade to decade from 1950 to the most recent decennial census for 2020. The new 2020 census count has limited meaning without understanding trends and dynamics of population growth and change leading up to it. We can see the change in magnitude of growth by calculating the differences between census years. And we can graph the results as decade population change. We will focus initially on the dynamics of growth and change from 1950 to 2010 using a consistent series of supporting data, and fill in 2010 to 2020 later with the new census population estimates. The basic components of population growth or change were natural increase and net migration. Natural increase was based on the difference between subcomponents of births and deaths. Net migration was the difference between number of people moving into and moving out of the county. Note the variability in magnitude of population change we graphed earlier. This reflected underlying dynamics or changes in the components of growth. Part of the variability was due to natural increase. The trend of natural increase was relatively smooth, with peak in the 1950s, followed by generally continuous decrease to 2010. The slight jump at 1990 to 2000 was due to an influx of young parents having more babies in that decade. There were obvious gaps to be accounted. If we subtract natural increase from population growth, we can account for the differences as net migration. Added here in red. Net migration was highly variable and accounted for most of the variation of population growth, particularly in the last 2 decades from 1990 to 2010. But what about 2020 and beyond? Natural increase in net migration data for 2010 to 2020, continuous with the previous decades, may be published later in 2021 or early 2022. In the meantime, the U.S. Census Bureau released population estimates along with estimates for natural increase in net migration for the years 2010 to 2020 in May of 2021. Given that the estimate series covered 10 full years, summary decade figures may be created, comparable to decade figures based on prior decennial censuses and other sources of data. This allows us to approximate underlying dynamics up to 2020. Armed with this information, we can begin to imagine a near future. The past trend of county growth continued from 2010 to 2020. We can calculate the differences between estimates to show population change for the 10 years of the sequence. Notice the irregular pattern of the population change trend. The pattern was predominantly defined by variation in net migration, and by far the majority of net migration was accounted to domestic movement of people resident in the United States, with only a small portion accounted to international migration. The dominance of net migration in the decade was a continuation of migration as the historical driver of population growth in the past from 2000 to 2010. However, the effect of net migration was mitigated by natural increase. The Census Bureau provided a 10-year trend of births and deaths to 2020, allowing us to consider the underlying components of natural increase directly. Consider first the number of babies born into the population each year. The trend was relatively flat. The number of people dying each year showed a more pronounced pattern of increase over the 10-year sequence. Graphing the two together provides a summary basis for calculating natural increase. Notice that in all years except 2011 to 12, deaths were greater than births, resulting in negative natural increase or natural decrease, reducing population growth. Graphing the summary figures for natural increase shows a defined trend, downward and progressively more negative. This continued a long-term historical trend of decrease from 1950 to 2010. We can graph population change and the two components together to see a comparative trend over 10 years. Given that this is a 10-year sequence, we can begin to imagine a near future by summing components across the 10-year span and graphing the results as an estimated full decade from 2010 to 2020. We then can add our graph of past decade trends to allow recent and near future analysis. The trend of declining natural increase continues and goes negative. Net migration also shows a trend of decrease. This results in a trend of reduced population change. Let us challenge our imagination and consider what a future beyond 2020 may look like. Natural increase will probably continue deeper into negative territory as the baby boom ages fully and deeper into senior years, resulting in more deaths, possibly along with a trend of lower births. Hard to say where net migration will go. It may increase, but it may also decrease, or continue relatively steady consistent with the recent decade. Whatever the case, population change may continue to decrease, due especially to the pull downward of greater negative natural increase. This probable dynamic is reflected in projections published in 2019 by the University of Tennessee Center for Business and Economic Research. Population change is projected to trend lower for several decades in the future. Thus, the county is projected to continue in a 170-year growth trend, but at a slower future pace than the recent peak of growth in the 2 decades from 1990 to 2010. These should be considered as provisional projections until the 2020 census count can be factored into subsequent projections expected late 2021 or early 2022. But differences may be small. The 3 2020 population figures used in this analysis diverged. The 2020 census count for Blount County was 135,280. The 2020 Census Population Estimate, produced a few months prior to release of the census count, was 529 less, or a little over 1/3 of 1% less than the census count. The 2020 projection of population, released in October of 2019, predated both the other figures by more than a year, and showed a larger divergence, being less by 1,472, or a little over 1% less than the census count. All in all, the combined use of all 3 population figures and associated data sets for 2020 and beyond painted a fair picture of population trends and dynamics from the past and into the future. To gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics of population growth and change in Blount County, I invite you to view the main Population at the Speed of Life video on the East Tennessee Quality Growth YouTube channel. Subscribe to this channel and click the notification button for future updates. Thank you for imagining with me.